The bulldozer's engine roared to life at precisely 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Thomas Washington stood on his front porch, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, watching as the massive yellow machine positioned itself at the edge of his property line like a mechanical predator preparing to devour his life's work. Behind the bulldozer, Melissa Crawford emerged from her pristine white Mercedes, her platinum blonde hair catching the morning sunlight as she adjusted her designer sunglasses. She moved with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way, her high heels clicking against the asphalt like bullets being chambered. "Mr. Washington," she called out, her voice carrying the false sweetness of artificial honey. "I hope you received our final notice." Thomas set his coffee down with deliberate slowness, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos erupting around him. At 62, he had learned that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially when dealing with people like Melissa Crawford, the newly elected HOA president of Sage Valley Estates, who had made destroying his life her personal mission. The final notice she referenced sat on his kitchen table, its legal terminology as sharp as broken glass. Property non-compliance enforcement action, it declared in bold letters. Unauthorized agricultural activities on residential property, immediate cessation required or face forced removal. Unauthorized agricultural activities. Thomas almost laughed at the absurdity. The 5 acres of rolling pasture behind his house, where 3 rescue horses grazed peacefully in the morning mist, had been designated agricultural land for 47 years. Long before Sage Valley Estates existed. Long before Melissa Crawford had moved from California with her tech executive husband and decided that rural Texas needed her particular brand of suburban improvement. "Mrs. Crawford," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent dealing with difficult people, "those horses aren't going anywhere." Melissa's smile sharpened to a predatory point. "Actually, Mr. Washington, they are. Along with that eyesore of a barn, those inappropriate fence lines, and anything else that violates our community standards." She gestured toward the bulldozer operator, a sun-weathered man who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mr. Jenkins here is going to help bring your property into compliance with HOA regulations today." The irony was staggering. Thomas had owned this land since 1976, had built his modest ranch house with his own hands, had raised his children in the shadow of the old oak tree that dominated his backyard. Sage Valley Estates, the gated community that now surrounded his property like a suffocating embrace, hadn't existed until 3 years ago, when developers had purchased the surrounding farmland and carved it into neat suburban squares. But somehow, through legal maneuvering that Thomas still didn't fully understand, his property had been incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction during the development process, a fact he had only discovered 6 months ago when Melissa Crawford had knocked on his door with a clipboard full of violations and an attitude that suggested she was doing him a favor by not calling the authorities immediately. The violations had started small. His mailbox was the wrong color. His fence needed to be 6 inches shorter. His driveway required resealing. Each citation came with escalating fines and increasingly aggressive language about community standards and property values. But the horses had been Melissa's line in the sand. "Livestock is prohibited in residential zones," she had declared during their first confrontation. "This isn't some backwoods farm, Mr. Washington. This is a premier residential community." Thomas had tried to explain that his land was grandfathered, that his agricultural exemption predated any HOA authority, that his horses were rescue animals with nowhere else to go. But Melissa Crawford operated in a world where legal technicalities mattered less than personal will, and she had made it clear that she intended to transform Sage Valley Estates into her vision of suburban perfection, with or without his cooperation. Now, watching the bulldozer operator check his hydraulics, Thomas felt the familiar burn of injustice rising in his chest. This was his land. These were his animals. This was his life, being systematically dismantled by a woman who had lived in the community for less than 2 years. But what Melissa Crawford didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined as she stood there in her designer clothes, preparing to destroy everything Thomas held dear, was that Thomas Washington wasn't just a stubborn old rancher who refused to modernize. He was also the elected mayor of Cedar Creek, the municipality that governed Sage Valley Estates and had the authority to override any HOA decision. A fact that was about to turn Melissa Crawford's moment of triumph into the beginning of her worst nightmare. The transformation of Cedar Creek from a sleepy farming community to a sprawling suburban municipality had been Thomas Washington's life's work. For 12 years, he had served as mayor, guiding the town through annexations, development agreements, and the delicate balance between progress and preservation that defined modern Texas politics. But Thomas wore his authority lightly. He drove the same pickup truck he'd owned for 15 years, worked his ranch every morning before heading to City Hall, and treated his mayoral duties as public service rather than political power. Most residents knew him as Tom the Rancher long before they knew him as Mayor Washington, which was exactly how Melissa Crawford had missed the most crucial detail about the man she was trying to destroy. The morning's confrontation had drawn a crowd. Neighbors lined the street, some watching from their perfectly manicured front yards, others emerging from their identical suburban homes with coffee cups and concerned expressions. The bulldozer's presence had transformed Thomas's quiet cul-de-sac into a spectacle that nobody had expected to witness in their upscale community. "Folks," Melissa announced, her voice projected for maximum impact, "what we're doing here today is protecting all of your property values. Mr. Washington's refusal to comply with community standards affects every single one of us." She pulled out a tablet and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. Livestock odors reduce property values by an average of 12% within a half-mile radius. Agricultural activities attract rodents and insects that pose health risks to families and pets. Fencing that doesn't meet HOA standards creates visual blight that impacts the entire neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. Thomas listened to the litany of complaints with growing amazement. Each accusation was more absurd than the last, but delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged by anyone with the power to fight back. What the gathering neighbors didn't know was that Thomas had spent the past 6 months conducting his own investigation into Melissa Crawford's HOA presidency. As mayor, he had access to municipal records, development agreements, and the original annexation documents that had brought Sage Valley Estates under Cedar Creek's jurisdiction. What he had discovered was a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond his own situation. The elderly Martinez family had been fined $8,000 for painting their house a shade of beige that was allegedly non-compliant with community standards. The fine print of the violation notice revealed that the approved color was available from only one paint contractor, who happened to be Melissa's brother-in-law. The Johnson family had been forced to remove their children's playground equipment because it violated noise ordinances that seemed to apply exclusively to families with school-age children. The Patels had been cited for parking their work van in their own driveway despite no specific prohibition in the original HOA charter. Each violation followed the same pattern, targeting families who were different from Melissa's vision of suburban homogeneity imposing arbitrary standards that served her personal preferences and escalating enforcement until compliance was achieved or families were forced to sell. But Thomas's case was different. His property represented something more than just another compliance issue. It was a symbol of the community's agricultural past that Melissa was determined to erase completely. "Mr. Washington," she continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand that change is difficult, but progress requires sacrifice. Your attachment to these animals is preventing our entire community from reaching its full potential." The word animals dripped with disdain, as if Thomas's 3 rescue horses were vermin rather than living creatures that had found sanctuary on his land. Star, a 20-year-old mare rescued from neglect. Thunder, a gelding saved from slaughter. Luna, a young filly born on the property to a pregnant mare that had arrived, half-starved and broken. These weren't livestock to Thomas. They were family members who depended on him for their survival. "Mrs. Crawford," Thomas said quietly, "those horses have been on this land for 8 years. This barn was built before your subdivision existed. My agricultural exemption was filed with the county long before any HOA authority was established." Melissa's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mr. Washington, I'm afraid your understanding of property law is rather simplistic. The development agreement that established Sage Valley Estates supersedes any previous land use designations. The HOA has full authority to enforce community standards, regardless of how long you've been violating them." She gestured toward the bulldozer operator again. "Mr. Jenkins, please proceed with the removal of non-compliant structures." But Jenkins hesitated, his weathered face creased with uncertainty. "Ma'am, I'm not sure about tearing down buildings without proper permits. Usually these kinds of operations require—" "The HOA board has provided all necessary authorizations," Melissa snapped. "Your job is to operate that machine, not question the legal framework." Thomas watched the exchange with growing clarity. Melissa wasn't just abusing her HOA authority, she was potentially violating multiple city ordinances regarding property modification, animal welfare, and proper permitting procedures. As mayor, Thomas had a responsibility to investigate potential municipal violations. Children. The Patels had been cited for parking their work van in their own driveway despite no specific prohibition in the original HOA charter. Each violation followed the same pattern, targeting families who were different from Melissa's vision of suburban homogeneity, imposing arbitrary standards that served her personal preferences, and escalating enforcement until compliance was achieved or families were forced to sell. But Thomas's case was different. His property represented something more than just another compliance issue. It was a symbol of the community's agricultural past that Melissa was determined to erase completely. "Mr. Washington," she continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "I understand that change is difficult, but progress requires sacrifice. Your attachment to these animals is preventing our entire community from reaching its full potential." The word animals dripped with disdain, as if Thomas's 3 rescue horses were vermin rather than living creatures that had found sanctuary on his land. Star, a 20-year-old mare rescued from neglect. Thunder, a gelding saved from slaughter. Luna, a young filly born on the property to a pregnant mare that had arrived, half-starved and broken. These weren't livestock to Thomas. They were family members who depended on him for their survival. "Mrs. Crawford," Thomas said quietly, "those horses have been on this land for 8 years. This barn was built before your subdivision existed. My agricultural exemption was filed with the county long before any HOA authority was established. Melissa's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Mr. Washington, I'm afraid your understanding of property law is rather simplistic. The development agreement that established Sage Valley Estates supersedes any previous land use designations. The HOA has full authority to enforce community standards, regardless of how long you've been violating them. She gestured toward the bulldozer operator again. Mr. Jenkins, please proceed with the removal of non-compliant structures. But Jenkins hesitated, his weathered face creased with uncertainty. Ma'am, I'm not sure about tearing down buildings without proper permits. Usually these kinds of operations require— The HOA board has provided all necessary authorizations, Melissa snapped. Your job is to operate that machine, not question the legal framework. Thomas watched the exchange with growing clarity. Melissa wasn't just abusing her HOA authority, she was potentially violating multiple city ordinances regarding property modification, animal welfare, and proper permitting procedures. As mayor, Thomas had a responsibility to investigate potential municipal violations, but as a property owner facing immediate destruction of his livelihood, he had a more personal stake in the outcome. Mrs. Crawford, Thomas said, pulling out his phone, before Mr. Jenkins proceeds, I think we need to clarify something about jurisdictional authority. Melissa's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Thomas scrolled through his contacts and dialed a number he knew by heart. Yes, this is Thomas Washington. I need code enforcement and animal control at my address immediately. We have an unauthorized demolition operation and potential animal welfare violations in progress. The effect was immediate and electric. Melissa's confident posture faltered as she realized that Thomas wasn't just passively accepting her authority. He was fighting back using systems she hadn't considered. Who exactly do you think you are? She demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested panic was setting in. Thomas smiled for the first time that morning, an expression that carried decades of experience dealing with bullies, bureaucrats, and people who confused volume with authority. Mrs. Crawford, he said quietly, I think it's time we had a proper introduction. But what happened next would expose not just Thomas's hidden identity, but the full scope of Melissa Crawford's misconduct and the legal vulnerabilities that would ultimately destroy her carefully constructed empire of suburban tyranny. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance suggested that the morning's confrontation was about to become something much larger and more consequential than anyone had anticipated. The Cedar Creek Police Department patrol car arrived first, followed closely by Code Enforcement Officer Patricia Lopez and Animal Control Supervisor Jim Henderson, all of whom stepped out of their vehicles with the respectful deference reserved for municipal officials they worked with daily. Morning, Mayor Washington, Officer Rodriguez called out, tipping his hat. What seems to be the situation? The words hit Melissa Crawford like a physical blow. Her face went through a spectrum of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. Mayor, she whispered, the word barely audible above the crowd's sudden murmur of recognition. Thomas Washington straightened to his full height, and suddenly the quiet rancher transformed before everyone's eyes. The same man who had been defending his property moments earlier now carried the unmistakable authority of elected office, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command. Officer Rodriguez, Thomas said formally, we have an unauthorized demolition operation in progress. Mrs. Crawford has ordered the destruction of legally permitted agricultural structures without proper municipal approval. Patricia Lopez was already taking photographs of the bulldozer and examining the property boundaries. Mayor, I don't see any demolition permits on file for this address. Any structural modifications require city approval, regardless of HOA authorization. Jim Henderson was walking toward the pasture where the three horses watched the proceedings with curious calm. These animals appear to be properly maintained and in good health. The facilities meet all county agricultural standards. Melissa Crawford stood frozen in the center of the unfolding chaos, her carefully orchestrated power play crumbling around her like a house built on quicksand. The neighbors—
Officer Rodriguez was taking notes. "Mayor, are we looking at potential criminal violations?" "Potentially," Thomas replied. "Unauthorized demolition, animal endangerment, harassment, and possibly extortion, depending on what our investigation reveals." Melissa finally found her voice, though it emerged as a high-pitched protest. "You can't do this. The HOA has legitimate authority. We have covenants and restrictions." Thomas turned to face her directly, his expression serious, but not unkind. "Mrs. Crawford, HOA authority is subordinate to municipal jurisdiction, always. Your covenants and restrictions cannot supersede city ordinances, county regulations, or state law." He gestured toward the bulldozer, which Jenkins had wisely shut down. "What you ordered here this morning constitutes multiple municipal violations: unauthorized demolition, potential animal cruelty, harassment of a city resident. Each of these carries both civil and criminal penalties." The crowd was growing as more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the unusual gathering of official vehicles. Thomas recognized many faces: residents he served as mayor, people who had voted for him in 3 consecutive elections, constituents who were now seeing their HOA president's actions from an entirely new perspective. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. "Mrs. Crawford," Thomas continued, "what you also don't understand is that I've been investigating HOA practices throughout our municipality for the past 6 months. Your management style has generated more municipal complaints than any other HOA in our jurisdiction." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through official documents. 17 formal complaints filed with the city, 12 requests for municipal intervention in HOA disputes, 8 families who have contacted our office about what they believe constitutes harassment, and—
The transformation was swift and merciless. Within 30 minutes, Thomas's quiet cul-de-sac had become the epicenter of a municipal investigation that would ultimately reshape how HOAs operated throughout Cedar Creek. News vans appeared as word spread through social media that the mayor was confronting corruption in his own neighborhood. City council members arrived to show support. Even the local newspaper sent a photographer to document what was becoming the most significant municipal governance story in years. But the real drama was just beginning. "Mrs. Crawford," Thomas said, his voice carrying the full weight of mayoral authority, "I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for attempted destruction of property and animal endangerment." The words hit like a thunderclap. Melissa staggered backward, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose as she struggled to process what was happening to her carefully constructed world. "You can't arrest me!" she shrieked. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority here." Officer Rodriguez stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Ma'am, the mayor has the legal right to make a citizen's arrest when witnessing criminal activity. You'll need to come with me." But Thomas held up his hand. "Actually, Officer Rodriguez, let's give Mrs. Crawford an opportunity to resolve this situation peacefully." He turned to address the crowd of neighbors, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. "Folks, what happened here this morning represents a fundamental breakdown of community governance. An HOA president attempted to destroy legally protected property without proper authority, endangering animals and potentially committing multiple municipal violations." Melissa tried to interrupt, but Thomas continued with the steady cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. "But this isn't just about one incident. Over the past 6 months, I've what appears to be targeted persecution of residents who don't fit a particular demographic profile." The crowd was growing restless. Residents who had been silent victims of Melissa's authoritarian management were beginning to speak up, their voices creating a chorus of long-suppressed grievances. "She fined us $3,000 for our kids' basketball hoop," called out Jim Martinez. We had to remove our herb garden because she said it looked unprofessional, added Sarah Chen. She tried to ban our family reunions because they were too noisy, shouted Maria Gonzalez. Each testimony revealed another layer of Melissa's systematic targeting of families who differed from her narrow vision of suburban conformity. Thomas listened with growing anger, realizing that his own situation was just the tip of a much larger iceberg of community abuse. Patricia Lopez had been documenting everything, taking photographs and interviewing residents. Mayor, what I'm seeing here suggests violations of fair housing laws, potentially discriminatory enforcement, and multiple breaches of municipal authority. Thomas nodded grimly. Patricia, I want a full investigation of every HOA action taken in the past 18 months. Compare enforcement patterns against demographic data. Look for evidence of selective prosecution. Melissa Crawford was slowly realizing that her morning of triumph had become a complete catastrophe. The bulldozer sat silent, its operator having wisely removed himself from the legal minefield. Her authority was evaporating as residents she had terrorized for months found their voices and began demanding accountability. But Thomas wasn't finished. Mrs. Crawford, he said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official municipal business, as mayor of Cedar Creek, I'm invoking emergency powers to suspend HOA enforcement authority pending a full investigation of your management practices. The legal implications hit Melissa like a physical assault. Without enforcement authority, the HOA couldn't collect fines, couldn't impose restrictions, couldn't function as the instrument of control she had wielded for months. You can't do that, she gasped. The state gives HOAs legal authority. You don't have the power to override state law. Thomas smiled grimly. Actually, Mrs. Crawford, municipal authority supersedes HOA jurisdiction in cases involving potential criminal activity, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. You should have learned that before attempting to bulldoze city property. He gestured toward his ranch, where the horses continued grazing peacefully in the morning sunshine. This land has been under agricultural exemption for 47 years. It's registered with the county, protected by state law, and grandfathered under every municipal ordinance. Your attempt to destroy it wasn't just harassment, it was potentially criminal destruction of legally protected property. The crowd's mood had shifted completely. What had begun as neighbors watching a property dispute had transformed into a community uprising against systematic oppression. Residents who had suffered in silence were now united in their anger against the woman who had made their lives miserable for personal satisfaction. Mayor Washington, called out elderly Mrs. Patterson, what can we do to make sure this never happens again? Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, families who had been divided and intimidated, now standing together in common cause. We're going to restructure HOA oversight throughout the municipality, he announced. New transparency requirements, community voting on major enforcement actions, independent appeals processes, and most importantly, regular municipal audits to ensure that HOA authority is used for community benefit, not personal power. Melissa Crawford stood alone in the center of the gathering, her empire of suburban tyranny crumbling around her. The bulldozer that was supposed to cement her authority had instead become the catalyst for her complete downfall. This isn't over, she said weakly, but her voice carried no conviction. Thomas Washington looked at her with something approaching pity. Mrs. Crawford, it's been over since the moment you decided that power was more important than service. You just didn't know it yet. The sirens in the distance suggested that the morning's events had attracted even more official attention, but Thomas no longer cared about the spectacle. His ranch was safe, his community was awakening, and justice was finally being served. But the most satisfying moment was still to come. 3 months later, Thomas Washington stood in the same spot where Melissa Crawford had ordered his barn demolished, but the scene had transformed beyond recognition. Where bulldozers had once threatened destruction, children now played safely in the shadow of the old oak tree. Where fear had dominated, laughter echoed across the pasture where Star, Thunder, and Luna grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. The Sage Valley Estates Community Center, formerly the HOA headquarters, buzzed with activity as residents participated in the first democratically elected board meeting in the subdivision's history. The voting wasn't just ceremonial, it represented a fundamental shift from authoritarian control to genuine community governance. The investigation had been swift and comprehensive. Melissa Crawford faced federal charges for civil rights violations, criminal charges for attempted destruction of property, and civil lawsuits from 11 families seeking damages for harassment and discriminatory enforcement. Her reign of suburban terror had lasted exactly 18 months, but its dismantling had taken less than 90 days. More importantly, the Sage Valley scandal had triggered municipal reforms throughout Cedar Creek. Thomas had signed legislation requiring HOA transparency, establishing resident appeals processes, and mandating municipal oversight of community governance. The new laws were being studied by cities across Texas as a model for preventing HOA abuse. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible in the faces of his neighbors. The Martinez family had restored their children's basketball hoop and added a second one for neighborhood games. The Chens had expanded their herb garden into a community vegetable plot that supplied fresh produce to elderly residents. The Gonzalez family's monthly reunions had become neighborhood celebrations that brought together families from across the subdivision. Fear had been replaced by fellowship. Control had given way to cooperation. Thomas still woke before dawn to tend his horses, still drove the same pickup truck to City Hall, still treated his mayoral duties as public service rather than political power. But now his morning routine included waves from neighbors who saw him not as a threat to their property values, but as the man who had stood up to tyranny when it mattered most. The barn that Melissa Crawford had tried to destroy had been expanded into a small community stable where neighborhood children learned to care for rescue animals. The pasture had been designated as protected agricultural land, ensuring that future development could never threaten the sanctuary Thomas had created for abandoned horses. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit on his front porch and watch the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The same view he had enjoyed for 47 years, but somehow it looked different now. Brighter. More hopeful. Melissa Crawford had moved back to California shortly after her legal settlement, her dream of suburban dominance destroyed by her own hubris. The house she had purchased for its proximity to Thomas's property, the better to monitor and harass him, now belonged to a young teacher who brought cookies to elderly neighbors and organized block parties that celebrated community rather than enforcing conformity. The bulldozer operator, Jim Jenkins, had stopped by several times to check on the horses and apologize for his role in the morning's drama. Thomas had hired him to build additional fencing for the expanded pasture, turning a tool of destruction into an instrument of sanctuary. But the most powerful testament to change was visible every Saturday morning when Thomas mowed his lawn with the same methodical precision that had always brought him peace. Now, instead of worried glances from neighbors fearful of HOA retaliation, children waved from their yard games and adults stopped to chat about community projects and shared concerns. The transformation from fear to fellowship had been complete. As Thomas walked toward his barn on this particular evening, Star nickered softly in recognition. Thunder lifted his head from the grass in greeting, and Luna trotted over to nuzzle his shoulder with the trusting affection of an animal that had never known anything but kindness. 3 rescued horses on 5 acres of protected land, surrounded by a community that had learned to value service over power, cooperation over control, and justice over arbitrary authority. In the fading light of another Texas sunset, Thomas Washington smiled as he realized that sometimes the greatest victories weren't won in courtrooms or council chambers, but in the quiet moments when ordinary people refused to let fear win over hope. The ranch that Melissa Crawford had tried to destroy had become exactly what she had always feared, a symbol that power belonged to the people, not to those who merely claimed to wield it.